Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2012 Royal Tyrrell Museum Speaker Series. Today, the Royal Tyrrell Museum and its cooperating society are proud to present Mrs. Annie Quinney. Annie is somewhat of a poster child for the Royal Tyrrell Museum. Annie grew up here in Drumheller, and throughout her high school years, she worked at the museum during the summers. So over the years, Annie has occupied nearly every single position available for summer staff, including gallery interpreter, science educator, security, and even the cafeteria. Her experience at the museum sparked her interest in geology and paleontology, so she decided to pursue a bachelor's degree in geoscience at the University of Calgary. As an undergraduate student, Annie was involved in many research projects, mainly involving trace fossils, and she has received several grants for her research. In the context of her bachelor's degree, Annie did an honors thesis on the geomechanics of living and extinct mammalian predators, including the saber-toothed Smilodon. After obtaining her bachelor's degree, Annie decided to continue with a master's degree also at the U of C. For her thesis, Annie spent an entire summer climbing the hills in the Drumheller Valley, looking for rocks that would allow her to reconstruct the ancient environments and climate in which dinosaurs lived 72 million years ago. Because of her groundbreaking and backbreaking contribution to paleontology, Annie is featured in a display dedicated to women in paleontology that can be seen here at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. Annie has completed her master's degree last fall, but she's now getting ready for a big move. She has accepted a position in the PhD program at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, and will be starting her studies in June of this year. Today, Annie will present the results of her research on the paleoenvironmental and paleoclimatic conditions recorded in the rocks exposed in the Drumheller Valley. So without further delay, I present you Mrs. Annie Quinney.
Do I just click this on here? Okay. I think we've got a green light here, so I think we're good to go. Thank you, everyone, for coming out here today. It's so nice to be back here at the museum and talking about something other than the location of the fire exits and the washrooms, which are just outside, just in case you're wondering. Before I get started on my talk, I just wanted to go over this picture here. So this picture was submitted to the Drumheller Mail for the article this week about the talk. And when the Drumheller Mail asked me, for a picture of me doing field work, I looked through my photos and I came across this gem and I just couldn't resist. And it brought back some memories. So this photo was actually taken just after my first year of university, and I was working at the museum, of course, as a science educator. So I had just finished Geology 203, and I was pretty much a brilliant geoscientist. I did not need to finish the rest of my degree. I knew everything there was to know. So the museum sent me to the hoodoos one day to do some policing of the hoodoos and a little interpretation. And of course, that's where they send all their really brilliant geoscientists. And I'm out at the hoodoos, and a van of people showed up. Of course, I offered them a little tour of the hoodoos, and would they like to learn about the rocks? And they said, yes, great. I could share all my brilliant knowledge with these tourists. So I'm talking about the rocks and how the valley formed and so on. And I'm getting blank stares, like they're not getting this. These guys must be pretty slow. They don't know what's going on. So I slowed things down. I was like, yes, the hoodoos, they're made out of sandstone. And sandstone is made out of sand. Nothing. I got nothing. So this went on for a little bit, and then they finally dispersed and took a couple of pictures of me at the hoodoos. And one guy actually hung around to chat a little bit. So he asked me, is this a summer job, and are you in school, and what are you taking, and so on. And I said, yeah, I'm in geology at U of C. And he's like, really? Because we're the geology department from U of C. I almost died. I almost died. I almost didn't go back to school. But luckily I did. And actually, to this day I still have no idea who that group was. But they have some really nice pictures of me holding my sandstone in front of the hoodoos. In any case, it's 7 years later, and I've finished my master's now. And what I've learned is that the more education that I get, the less I realize I actually know. There's so much to know, and you know, I'll never learn it all. However, today's talk is on something that I hopefully know a little bit about. And the title of that talk is Paleosols, linking episodes of Cretaceous climate change to changes in dinosaur diversity. Now this talk, that sounds pretty interesting, right? Maybe that's part of the reason you came here today. And that's because I've included some pretty sexy words in this title. Right? You're reading this title and you're thinking, yeah, dinosaurs, I like those. And climate change, that sounds pretty interesting. But you may also be reading this title and you're thinking, okay, dinosaurs are awesome and climate change is pretty cool, but the rest of it might as well be in Chinese because I have no idea what you're talking about. Like seriously, what is a paleosol? Don't worry, we're going to figure that out here today, and we're also going to learn that paleosols are also really sexy. Before we can do that, though, we need to go over a few basics. So we're going to have a look at my study area here in the Drumheller River Valley, and we're going to go over a little bit of the background of the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, and that's the formation that makes up most of the rocks that we see here in the valley. Then we're going to go right into the sexy stuff. I know you're excited. Right into a little bit about the Horseshoe Canyon Formation paleosols. Then we're going to see how the Horseshoe Canyon Formation paleosols can tell us about the climates and environments that existed at the time of the dinosaurs. Pretty good stuff. Then we'll compare those paleoclimatic and paleoenvironmental interpretations to a faunal turnover, so a change in the types of animals that existed in Cretaceous Drumheller. Then we'll go over a few conclusions and then I'll set you guys free. So that's the plan for today. As promised, right into the study area. So this is a map of Drumheller, probably something you're all pretty familiar with, and it outlines all the different locations that I visited in the summer of 2010. Those are outlined here in the gray dots. So again, sites you're probably pretty familiar with. Just in case though, so we're all on the same page, we're going to take a little photographic field trip through the valley. And we're going to start in the southeast corner of the map at the Hoodoos. So these are a couple of snapshots at the Hoodoos without me, without my sandstone, which is a good thing. And if you've ever been to the Hoodoos, you know that the base is actually made up of a dark brown mudstone. This mudstone belongs to the Bear Paw Formation. Directly above that mudstone is a sharp contact with the overlying sandstone, and that actually marks the base of the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, so the beginning of where I started to look at my rocks. If you were to keep going northwest up the river valley, you'd actually be getting younger in time. So the rocks you see become progressively younger. So that by the time you get to Horseshoe Canyon, for example, you've traveled through several millions of years of deposition, which is pretty cool. The Horseshoe Canyon Formation itself is late Campanian to early Maastrichtian in age, and it covers almost 6 million years of sediment accumulation. This is a pretty long time, so it's not surprising that the Horseshoe Canyon Formation is actually really quite thick. We're looking at about 250 to 275 meters of sediment in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation that I had to go look at. It consists of interbedded sandstone, siltstone, mudstone, siderite, bentonite, all sorts of good things. And of course, we also have coal in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation. The Horseshoe Canyon Formation has several equivalent formations, including the St. Mary River Formation, as well as a few others listed here. Now, Drumheller today, of course, is in the middle of the landlocked prairies, and the only water we see is the Red Deer River. Pretty good. But at the time of the dinosaurs, we were actually located right on the edge of a huge inland sea called the Bear Paw Sea. So that's Drumheller back at the time of the dinosaurs. Must have been pretty nice for those dinosaurs back in the Cretaceous. Now, if you remember, we said that the base of the Hoodoos was made up of the Bear Paw Formation. It makes sense, of course, that the Bear Paw Formation was actually deposited by that huge inland sea. So those rocks at the base of the Hoodoos were deposited by an ocean, an inland sea. They're marine rocks. The sediments of the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, then, directly above that Bear Paw Formation, are actually derived terrestrially. They're sourced from land. And they're actually sourced from the Rocky Mountains, which were forming just off to the west at about the same time that the Horseshoe Canyon Formation was being deposited. So it's not surprising that the rocks of the Horseshoe Canyon Formation are actually really influenced by mountain building, so changes in tectonics, but also changes in relative sea level and even changes in climate. So it's a really interesting formation to look at. Oops. All right. This diagram was done by our very own Dr. Eberth. And he actually came up with subdivisions for the Horseshoe Canyon Formation. So what we see in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation is major changes in lithology that are inferred to reflect those changes in tectonics and sea level and climate. So he came up with this basic subdivision for the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, and we can see that it's divided into 5 distinct lithologic units. So number 1 is at the bottom, and it's the oldest, and unit 5 is at the top, and it is the youngest. And we notice that part of the basis for this subdivision is based on the presence or absence of coals and the size and stacking patterns of ancient channel deposits, which are these guys here. Now, the most important thing to keep in mind is that the presence or absence of coals and the size of paleochannels was originally used as the basis for paleoenvironmental and paleoclimatic reconstruction. So the idea was really coaly units, such as Unit 1 and Unit 5, were deposited during really warm and wet times, whereas units lacking coal, such as 2, 3, and 4, they were deposited in much drier times, drier, cooler times. So that's something to keep in mind throughout the rest of this presentation, because it's going to be a theme that we see reoccurring. The other thing we notice is that Unit 1 is really thick. It actually makes up about 60% of the formation, and the remaining 40% is divvied up between Units 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at Unit 1, and I apologize for the quality of these pictures. They look a little fuzzy. In any case, Unit 1 again is really, really coaly. It actually contains 10 coal seams, and those are numbered 0 through 9. It also contains a lot of channels that are isolated below coal 7, but they become stacked above coal 7. So Unit 1 was deposited right on the edge of that Bearpaw Sea in a coastal environment. So it actually records the marine to non-marine transition. So Unit 1 was deposited during a time of moderate to high accommodation space, so there was, a fair amount of room for sediments to accumulate at the time Unit 1 was being deposited. There was also a relatively restricted sediment supply, so not a lot of sediments coming in, but it does increase above coal 7. The other thing that we really want to note is that the Horseshoe Canyon Formation was deposited during a time when that Bearpaw Sea level was dropping. And it drops throughout most of the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, and we especially see that in Unit 1. Unit 1 is definitely regressive. Of course, because of the abundance of coals and the large channels in Unit 1, Unit 1 was inferred to have been deposited during a relatively warm and wet time. And that brings us to Unit 2. Unit 2 is really distinct from Unit 1. It doesn't look like it at all. It's a different color, it only has 1 coal seam, and the beds are much thinner with smaller channel deposits. We also see the occurrence of some brackish water clam and oyster fossils, so some marine fossils. That's a little strange. What's going on there? So the reasons for the differences between Unit 1 to Unit 2 may be associated with a change in accommodation space and sediment supply. So accommodation space is still really low in Unit 2, and sediment supply is still restricted. One of the big changes we see in Unit 2 is there's actually a big rise in sea level. There's a major transgression in Unit 2 known as the Drumheller marine tongue that actually occurs around the level of coal 10. Again, because Unit 2 has very little coal, very small channels, it was deposited probably in a cooler and dry time. Unit 3 is interesting because it's a really prominent feature in outcrop. It's really obvious in outcrop because it consists entirely of stacked channels. It's a really sandy unit, but there's actually no paleosols preserved in Unit 3, so we didn't actually do too much with Unit 3. Unit 3 is different from Unit 2, again, because it has a low accommodation space, still restricted sediment supply, and then there's a little debate as to whether or not it was deposited during a marine high stand, so when sea level was really high, or during a regressive phase, but not something we need to worry about too much here. Again, no coals in Unit 3, so cool and dry, thought to be similar to Unit 2. Moving on up, that brings us to Unit 4. And Unit 4 is another non-coaly unit with isolated channels. So Unit 4 sees an increase in accommodation space, but sediment supply is still restricted. So not a lot of sediment supply coming in, even though we have space to accumulate it. And sea level is regressive throughout the deposition of this unit. So sea level is still dropping off at this time. No coals, small channels, cool and dry throughout the deposition of Unit 4. And finally, that brings us to Unit 5, which is our youngest unit at the top of the formation. Unit 5 sees the return of coaly deposits, so things that we haven't seen since Unit 1. We also see large stack channels in Unit 5. Again, something else we haven't seen since Unit 1. Unlike Unit 1, though, Unit 5 was not deposited on the edge of a sea. The Bearpaw Sea is inferred to have regressed really far to the east at this time and to have no influence on the deposition of this unit. So what's causing this? Well, instead in Unit 5, we see an increase in accommodation space. So there's a lot of sinking going on at this time, a lot of subsidence. And we also see an increase in sediment supply. So we may be dropping below the water table at this time. Sea level, again, regressive. The sea is way off to the east at this time and has no influence on this unit. And finally, because we've got that nice return of coaly deposits at this time, it was probably warmer and wetter. So interesting things going on in Unit 5. Now that we are familiar with the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, we can begin to look at some of the methodologies that I used for my master's research. So for my master's research, I knew that I wanted to test this idea that coaly units were associated with warm and wet times. And I knew that I wanted to test them using paleosols. So what exactly is a paleosol? What are we looking for? Well, paleosol is simply a fossilized ancient soil. That's it. Now, we've all seen soils forming in the modern, and we know that they form at the surface of the earth via the very slow interaction of rock with air and water, chemicals, organisms, a whole bunch of different things. And again, they form over a very long period of time. And what we're looking for in modern soils is we see that there's differently colored layers. Those are called horizons. We see root traces, we see bioturbation, so organisms are in that soil and they're churning it up. We've got a whole bunch of different things going on in a modern soil. Now, because paleosols are simply fossilized ancient soils, we're looking for the same things. So this is one of my Cretaceous soils, and you can clearly see differently colored layers that correspond to horizons. Pretty cool to have that preserved in the fossil record. All right. So we know what we're looking for out in the field. How do we go about collecting it? Well, the first step is to expose fresh rock by excavating a vertical trench. So this most often, Francois, thank you, involves standing on some vertical cliff, swinging a pickaxe, and trying not to fall into the cactus patch at the bottom of the hill. It only happened once. It wasn't that bad. Okay, it was that bad. It was terrible. But that's what you're looking for. So you want to expose fresh rock so you can collect fresh rock. So cactus was not the only problem that I ran into in the field. If you recall, summer 2010 in Drumheller was moist. It was so wet. This was the forecast for the entire summer. And while rain is good, the Drumheller Valley is actually full of bentonite, which is a swelling clay. So it's going to absorb all that rainwater, and it's going to become a sticky, slippery mess. Really fun to watch people who don't expect it to walk on bentonite, but it's a real hindrance to the collection of paleosols. It was a big problem that summer. That was kind of funny. All right, so sometimes it did dry up summer of 2010, and I did actually make it out into the field to excavate some paleosols. So once I've correctly identified my paleosol and excavated my paleosol, then I want to note the features that I see. Are there horizons? Are there root traces? Is there bioturbation? All that sort of stuff. I want to write that down. And I also want to note my stratigraphic position. So where exactly am I in that Horseshoe Canyon formation? Am I in Unit 1? Am I in Unit 5? That's really important information to have. Once I've done all that, then I can actually begin collecting my samples. So you want to make sure that you collect samples from every horizon at about a 20 centimeter interval. And doing that, you end up with quite a few samples. So even though I had cactus and rain to fight with all summer, by the end of the summer I still had managed to collect over 500 samples from 78 paleosol profiles that I now needed to take back to the lab and analyze. All right. Now the really interesting thing about paleosols is that from the study of paleosols, we can actually learn a lot about the environmental and climatic conditions under which that soil originally formed. And I mentioned that I wanted to note my stratigraphic position in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, and that actually permitted me to get a high-resolution reconstruction of how climate changing from the late Campanian to the early Maastrichtian. So how did climate change during the whole time that that Horseshoe Canyon Formation was being deposited? So specifically, we can use the hydrology, degree of development, pedogenic features of paleosols as a proxy for interpreting those climatic and environmental conditions. Pretty cool, pretty sexy, yes? Yes, good. All right, how are we going to do this? Well, there's certain features preserved in paleosols that can actually tell you about those environmental conditions. So these are features that we can see with the naked eye out in the field. For example, if you have a paleosol that maybe has a nice big coal deposit at the top, but maybe underneath everything looks kind of gray and drab, those are called glade horizons. And they're actually formed as a result of the paleosol being waterlogged. So this entire paleosol profile was saturated with water, and that's the reason we see the features that we do. On the other hand, if you have a paleosol that forms under really dry, well-drained conditions, you may see features such as brightly colored horizons, maybe salts or caliche or carbonate nodules, maybe even red beds. So something a little bit more interesting to look at with the dry, well-drained paleosols. You may also have paleosols that experienced alternating wet and dry conditions. And in that case, you may get features of the wet paleosols, and you may also get features of the dry paleosols. But what's unique to the alternating wet and dry paleosols are slickensides. Slickensides are a really cool feature. That's what's shown here. Slickensides actually form by the alternating wetting and drying of a soil, which causes movement. And the movement causes particles of clay to slip past each other, and they'll actually align on surfaces within the paleosol profile. Pretty cool stuff. Petrographic study is a really important tool for the study of paleosols because a lot of the features that we see just aren't observable to the naked eye. They're microscopic. So we want to use microscopes to study paleosols so that we can see things such as subtle bioturbation, so that churning up by organisms in the paleosol, and maybe even really fine root traces that may have otherwise go unnoticed. We may also see features such as papules, which are just microscopic balls of clay that suggest erosion. But one of the most important features that we're looking for in the microscopic study of paleosols is B fabric. B fabric is the alignment of clays in the ground mass of a soil that can tell you a bunch of different things about the soil. So it can tell you about the degree of development, it can tell you about the position of translocated clays, maybe it can even tell you if it was subject to alternating wet and dry conditions. So a really important tool. Of course, we can also use geochemistry to supplement our study of paleosols, and this is an interesting study. What we did for our paleosols is we actually did bulk geochemical analyses using X-ray fluorescence. And from the relative abundance of each element, we actually calculated some molecular weathering ratios. And these ratios were developed by Feeks and Retallick as a proxy for the weathering process. So it tells you how much pedogenesis or soil forming actually took place in that soil. And what we did is we calculated these for each horizon of our paleosol profile, and then we plotted them so we could see how the geochemistry was changing down profile, a pretty important tool. From well-drained paleosols, we can also calculate mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation. This is significant because it actually gives us real, tangible numbers to apply to these paleosols. How much rain were they getting? Were they not getting much rain? Did they form in desert environments, tropical environments, and all that sort of stuff? So really exciting stuff here. All right, so now that we've covered the different methodologies, we can get right into that sexy material as promised, and we can look at the Horseshoe Canyon Formation paleosols. So there were 9 categories of paleosols that I discovered in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, and these were based on morphological differences, so 9 distinct types of paleosols. And these can be lumped into 3 different categories, 3 different groups that represent drainage conditions. So the first group, and we're going to focus mostly on the groups today just for time's sake. The first group are the poorly drained paleosols, the second group are the well-drained paleosols, and the third group are the moderately drained paleosols. And we're going to step through those now. All right, what are we looking for in our poorly drained paleosols? Well, poorly drained paleosols are actually really common in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation. I saw a lot of them. So they're the paleosols that are capped by a coal horizon and have really drab, boring colors underneath. So those are the glade horizons underneath. We may also see features such as sphaerosiderite, and that's what this picture is depicting here. And those form under anoxic conditions. But one of the most common features in the poorly drained paleosols are redoxymorphic features. So when a paleosol is saturated with water, it can actually mobilize iron. So iron will migrate throughout the profile. And in the center of this feature, we see that we're depleted in iron, but iron has accumulated along the edge. So that's caused by water in the profile. Not surprisingly, poorly drained paleosols, they form in depressions and wetlands, low-lying areas that have a really high water table, so saturated areas. This is a typical geochemical plot of poorly drained paleosols, and you can see that they're kind of boring. Little boring. There's not too much going on here. They plot pretty much as straight lines, and that's because they were saturated with water, and so everything sort of gets homogenized. Not too much variation down profile, so not too much to look at there. Little disappointing, not so sexy. However, the well-drained paleosols, they give us a little bit more to look at. So in well-drained paleosols, we may see features such as clay coatings and alluviated iron. So this is alluviated iron here, and that's a clay coating right there. The formation of features like this is actually analogous to the making of coffee. So if you can imagine making coffee in the morning, you've got your water percolating through your coffee grounds, and it picks up all that beautiful caffeine and good flavor, and then it redeposits some nice coffee, a nice flavorful beverage, in the coffee pot underneath. Well, the same thing happens in the alluviation process. So rainwater percolates through your soil profile, and it'll pick up bits of clay and bits of iron, and then it'll redeposit it lower down in the profile. So instead of a nice flavorful beverage, you get a smear of clay. Almost as good. Almost. If your paleosol is subject to really dry conditions, so rainwater is restricted, you may get carbonate developing, and I did see that in one of my categories of paleosols, but it was really minimal and not very common in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation. If your paleosol is subject to alternating wet and dry conditions, you may see slicken sides, and this is a photomicrograph of some slicken sides in one of my paleosols. Well-drained paleosols, they're going to form in your elevated areas, so areas that don't have a really high water table, and they have unimpeded drainage, so things can just drain freely through that profile. Something a little more interesting to look at is the geochemical plots of the well-drained paleosols. And you can see we've got a little bit of wiggle to these profiles. So this suggests that the chemistry varies as you go down profile. And that's because of processes such as alluviation. So something a little more interesting to look at there. And finally, we get to our moderately drained paleosols. So our moderately drained paleosols are paleosols that are saturated in the lower portion, but are well drained in the upper portion. So in the upper portion of the paleosol profile, you're going to see features such as clay coatings and alluviated iron, but lower down, it's going to get drab and a little boring. You may see some redoxymorphic features, but the colors are going to be pretty gray. Granted, this picture does not do it justice. But trust me, in the field, this paleosol horizon up here was much brightly colored than the ones lower down. So that's my moderately drained paleosol there. Geochemically, we can see we've got a little bit of wiggle up top where we had well-drained conditions, but lower down where it becomes saturated, things kind of flatten out and it gets boring again. So that's the geochemical plot for the moderately drained paleosols. All right. now that we know the different types of paleosols we can see in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, we can begin to look at how they're distributed. So where are we seeing these different types of paleosols in the valley? This graph here has three different categories, the three different categories of paleosols depicted. So in this first gray box here, we've got our poorly drained paleosols. And then between the two dashed blue lines, there, in the light gray box, we've got our moderately drained paleosols. And finally, in this white box off to the side here, we've got our well-drained paleosols. So black dots on this plot represent paleosols that I actually collected out in the field and their stratigraphic positions, so where they're located relative to coals and so on. You'll also notice that there are some open squares on this plot, and those represent paleosols collected in another study in 2002 by Faulkner, and he studied paleosols of the upper Horseshoe Canyon Formation and beyond. And then in places where both Faulkner and I where we both found the same things, you'll see that we've got some open circles. Now, if you remember back to that geochemistry slide, I said that from the well-drained paleosols, we could calculate mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation. So using all the paleosols located in this white box here, we actually did those calculations. Voila! Some results, some real tangible numbers. So again, from those well-drained paleosols, we calculated some mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation. The precipitation estimates are in this first column, and the temperature estimates are in this second column. And just to make things a little bit simpler, we'll step through unit by unit. Unit 1, of course, was dominated by poorly drained paleosols, and that's because we were right on the edge of that Bear Paw Sea. So sea level was really high, water table levels were really high, things were mostly pretty wet. Luckily, we did have two occurrences of well-drained paleosols that we could actually calculate mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation from. And what we found was that we received about 972 millimeters of precipitation per year, and it was pretty warm at that time, on average about 10.6 degrees Celsius per year. So a relatively warm and wet time for the dinosaurs in Unit 1. This is a paleoenvironmental reconstruction, or I guess it's a modern analog of what we expect Drumheller may have looked like at the time Unit 1 was being deposited. So again, we're right on the edge of that Bear Paw Sea. Sea level is high, water table levels were high. Everything was pretty swampy and pretty wet at the time of Unit 1. That brings us to Unit 2, and we see that Unit 2 has got a lot of variation in the types of paleosols we observe. We've got poorly drained, moderately drained, and well-drained. We've got it all. The first thing that we notice is that poorly drained conditions actually squeak across the Unit 1, Unit 2 boundary. Now this is in contrast to what we would expect based on the distribution of coals. Again, coals are associated with wet, swampy times, and yet we've got this wet paleosol associated with no coal across that Unit 2 boundary. So something a little strange going on there. The other thing we notice is that after that, drainage conditions seem to improve, and then they get worse again. And we've got this really poorly drained paleosol at about the level of coal 10. What's really interesting about that paleosol is it actually coincides with the maximum transgression of the Drumheller marine tongue. So it was a big sea level rise that resulted in the rising of water table levels and the production of a poorly drained paleosol. Then as sea level drops off again, drainage improves, and we get better drainage in our paleosols. A really cool story that ties right into sea level changes. From those well-drained paleosols, of course, we did our little calculations, and we found that there is a rapid decline in mean annual precipitation and mean annual temperature at about this level in here, right in there. So what we notice is that warm and wet conditions, they also persist across that Unit 1, Unit 2 boundary, even though we don't have any coals. We're still getting a lot of precipitation. Then what happens is we drop off by 183 millimeters of precipitation per year, and things cool down by 1.3 degrees Celsius. Those cool and drier conditions, those hang around throughout the rest of Unit 2, so that on average, Unit 2 is a little bit cooler and a little bit drier than Unit 1. This would be a modern analog, perhaps, for what Unit 2 may have looked like in the Cretaceous. And we see that it may have been similar to something like a subtropical forest, and that's based on the predominance of well-drained paleosols in this unit, although we were still receiving relatively abundant rainfall at this time. So probably a subtropical forest in the late Cretaceous at Unit 2. Unit 3, sadly, no paleosols. So we couldn't do any mean annual temperature or mean annual precipitation estimates for that. So we'll go right into Unit 4, and we notice that Unit 4 is dominated by well-drained paleosols. This is great. We can use all those well-drained paleosols to calculate temperature and precipitation. And we see in Unit 4 that things cool down and get drier relative to Unit 2. So continued cooling and drying through Unit 4. It's still relatively similar to the top of Unit 2, but it's definitely cooler and drier than Unit 1. The other thing we notice is that at the very top of Unit 4, we have the return of a singular poorly drained paleosol. I actually didn't document that paleosol. That was done by Faulkner, and we'll touch on that later. This is our modern analog for Unit 4. So based on, of course, the predominance of really well-drained paleosols, relatively dry paleosols, they likely came from the well-drained interfluves, so well-drained areas in between ancient channels, such as that. Unit 5, our youngest unit, we've made it to the top. And what do we see in Unit 5? Well, we see the return of predominantly poorly drained conditions. So swampy conditions return in Unit 5, along with the return of the coals. So unfortunately for me, in my study area, I didn't actually find any well-drained paleosols in Unit 5. Thank goodness for Faulkner, he saved me. He's got a couple of well-drained paleosols that we could use to calculate temperature and precipitation. And from those paleosols, we see that temperature increases and precipitation increases by a whole bunch. So we've got a return to Unit 1 type climatic conditions, along with that return of coal. Pretty cool story for Unit 5. This is what Unit 5 may have looked like at the time of the dinosaurs. So based on the predominance of poorly drained paleosols, it was probably pretty swampy at the time of Unit 5. All right, so just to recap what we've gone through so far, we see that poorly drained conditions, they persist across the Unit 1, Unit 2 boundary, which is in contrast to what we expect based on the presence or absence of coals. So we would expect a coal to be associated with those poorly drained conditions, but it's not. The other thing we notice is that those warm, wet conditions that were established in Unit 1, they also persist across that Unit 1, Unit 2 boundary, again, in contrast to what we expect based on coals. Cool and dry conditions are established in Unit 2, and we infer those to continue through Unit 3 and are definitely present in Unit 4. Then we've got a transition, again, in environmental conditions where we go from well-drained paleosols to poorly drained conditions right at the top of Unit 4. And then in Unit 5, somewhere in Unit 5, those poorly drained conditions are maintained, but conditions return to really warm and really wet. Okay, so this brings us to the exciting part. Why have we done all this paleoenvironmental reconstruction? What was the point of this? Well, it turns out that there is a well-documented faunal turnover in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation. So what we see is that some dinosaurs and other vertebrates, they live for a long time, and then they disappear and are replaced by a new set of animals. And the idea was that those changes were related to environmental and climatic changes based on the presence or absence of coals. So, this is what they came up with. We know that Unit 1 was, based on the presence of coals, was probably really wet and really swampy at that time. And then things dried up and cleared up and got a little cooler through Units 2, 3, and 4 based on the absence of coals. And then again in Unit 5, warm and wet conditions return. If we compare that to what we see in the fossil record, we see that turtle diversity changes at the same time that there's a major change in lithology. So in Unit 1, we've got 4 different types of turtles preserved, but that drops off to 0 in Unit 2. And that transition coincides with the disappearance of coals. So far we've got a pretty good story. Not bad. But then if we look at other vertebrates, such as dinosaurs, we see we've got a bunch of ceratopsians and Edmontosaurus, Champsosaurus, crocodiles. They're all hanging around in Unit 1 where it's nice and swampy and everything's good. But uh-oh, they sneak across that Unit 1, Unit 2 boundary. Even though we've suggested that there's climate change due to the disappearance of coals and that the faunal distribution is associated with climate, they're still sneaking across that boundary. Something strange going on there. There's a little gap. And then in Unit 3, we see the appearance of Parsosaurus, Saurolophus, and Hypacrosaurus. So brand new dinosaurs in Unit 3 that we didn't see before, and they're, of course, in association with some cooler and drier climates. But we don't see them down here. A little strange. And we've got one type of turtle. At the very top of Unit 4, there's a transitional fauna established. So along with Parsosaurus, Saurolophus, and Hypacrosaurus, we also see the return of Atrociraptor and Champsosaurs. So animals that we haven't seen since Unit 1. Weird. Then we get to Unit 5, and Champsosaurs and crocodiles hang around, but these guys are gone, and Eotriceratops appears, along with a different type of turtle. So there is clearly some ties with environmental change associated with coals and changes in faunal distribution, but a more complicated story can be told. The idea that the occurrence of these dinosaurs is somehow related to environment, so controlled environmentally, is a really good idea, though. Most often we see ceratopsians, Edmontosaurus, Atrociraptor, they're typically associated with swampy environments. So it really makes sense that their occurrence is tied in with environmental conditions. And then we see Parsosaurus, Hypacrosaurus, and Saurolophus. Well, those animals are typically known for drier, more upland areas. So again, occurring in drier Units 3 and 4, that kind of makes sense. And then the return of Eotriceratops, a ceratopsian, in Unit 5, that's good. Return of swampy conditions, it makes sense. Similarly, the distribution of turtles may be associated with climate change. So for example, Odocus is thought to be really climatically sensitive and is only known from units that are considered relatively warm. So it's thought that the distribution of turtles in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation is probably associated with climate as well. So in order to refine some of these ideas, I decided to compare the distribution of vertebrates in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation to my episodes of climate and environmental change based on paleosols. The first green line that you see here, that represents the transition from poorly drained conditions to well-drained conditions, so an environmental change. And this environmental change, it coincides really nicely with that disappearance of turtles. Not bad. The second thing we notice is this red line, and that red line coincides with the transition from warm and wet conditions in Unit 1 to the cooler and drier conditions that are maintained throughout Units 2, 3, and 4. We notice that that occurs after the disappearance of turtles. So it seems that, at least in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, the distribution of turtles is controlled by environmental change before climatic changes ever even occurred. That brings us to this blue line, and the blue line represents the return of well-drained conditions after the Drumheller marine tongue regressed, so after sea levels dropped off. And we see that the occurrence of this blue line ties in nicely with the disappearance of the Unit 1 type swampy wet dinosaurs. A really good tie-in there. And then there's that little gap, and then at the Unit 3 boundary, we see the appearance of Saurolophus, Hypacrosaurus, and Parsosaurus in association with those cooler and drier climates. And then, at the very top of Unit 4, we've got the occurrence of Atrociraptor and Champsosaurus, so the establishment of a transitional fauna. And that coincides really nicely with the return of poorly drained conditions at the very top of Unit 4. And then, of course, in Unit 5, these dinosaurs are gone, and Eotriceratops appears in association with the return of those warmer, wetter climates. So it appears that, at least in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, the diversity of vertebrates is more strongly controlled by environmental change than climate change. And normally, this would be a really good spot to end my talk, a really good high note to end on, a good story. But at the time of my defense, I suggested that some further study into the first and last occurrences of some of these animals might provide some more insight into which animals could adapt and which animals were adapting to changing conditions in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation. And wouldn't you know it, somebody did just that. And he was here last week in the speaker series, and that was Jordan Mallon. And he described the occurrence of Anchiceratops in the middle of Unit 4. So this puts me in a bit of a pickle because I have just finished saying that ceratopsians are really closely associated with warm, wet, swampy environments, and yet this guy shows up in the middle of my coolest, driest unit and tramples all over my good story. Not good. So I'm reading Jordan's paper, and I'm sweating buckets, and I'm thinking, oh, my thesis was all for nothing, and I'll never publish, and what was the point, and my story is ruined. It's horrible. When I get to the end of the paper, and Jordan saves me with a line that reads, Anchiceratops was more eurytopic than other ceratopsians. According to dictionary.com, a very reliable source, this means that Anchiceratops, unlike most ceratopsians, was able to live in a wide range of environmental conditions. So lucky for Jordan, my good story is still a go. So thank you, Jordan. All right, so what did we learn here today? Well, we learned that the Horseshoe Canyon Formation was subject to variable drainage conditions. So it fluctuated between really poorly drained conditions in Unit 1, and they improved through Units 2, 3, and 4, and then they get really wet and swampy in Unit 5 again. Although we do see that marine transgression, which brings back swampy environments temporarily in Unit 2. We also learned that warm and wet conditions existed in Unit 1, and then a period of rapid cooling and drying occurred within Unit 2. So not at the Unit 1, Unit 2 boundaries we may have expected based on the presence or absence of coals. We've also learned that the faunal turnover cannot be linked simply to episodes of environmental and climatic change. There's a really complex relationship between the two. So changes in turtle diversity appear to be strongly related to environmental changes, again, the disappearance of those swampy conditions. And we also see that the Unit 1 dinosaur assemblage survives that first wave of environmental and climatic changes, and then it disappeared in association with the Drumheller marine tongue regression. And this was actually something that I forgot to mention. And I'm just going to step back for a second. Bear with me. If the occurrence of these dinosaurs is really strongly associated with environmental changes, then why didn't we see these dinosaurs disappear at the first episode of environmental change, so when those poorly drained conditions first occurred? I believe that these dinosaurs were probably able to at least adapt temporarily to changing environmental and climatic conditions. So they were able to persist past that first wave of changing environmental conditions, and then were probably sustained for a little bit longer by the return of swampy conditions that were brought about by the Drumheller marine tongue transgression. And then when that dropped off, sea level dropped off, and well-drained conditions returned, that's when these dinosaurs finally called it quits as well. So I just forgot to mention that, and I just wanted to step through that. All right, so that's something else we learned. We also learned that the cool and dry dinosaur assemblage persists throughout Units 3 and 4, and that a warm, wet assemblage returns in Unit 5. Finally, we learned that new discoveries can mess with your story, so you need to publish quickly. And then it can change. After that, it's fine. Finally, we've also learned that paleosols reflect the interplay between tectonics, relative sea level, and climate change, and are therefore also really sexy, and part of the reason why you came here today. So I'd just like to thank everybody from the museum, my supervisors, the curators, the museum cooperating society staff, for all your help and support. Of course, all the funding agencies. I couldn't have done my research without your support, so thank you. I'd also like to thank my lovely field assistants who were there rain or shine, whether they wanted to be or not. So thank you to them. And of course, I'd like to thank my parents who let me become a parasite in summer of 2010 and move back in with them so I could complete my field work. So that's my talk for today, and thank you all for coming out here today.